Welcome to The Explainer. Today we are tackling one of the most profound, truly defining contradictions in global history. We're looking at the early Spanish Empire in the Americas. A colonial system built on what was essentially an impossible balancing act. Because on one hand, you had this relentless drive to exploit indigenous bodies and lands to extract just immense wealth. But on the other hand, the empire simultaneously claimed its primary sacred mission was to save their souls. It's a massive, jarring paradox.
Okay, let's dive into this. How exactly does an empire justify the unjustifiable? Like, how do institutions legally and morally rationalize systems of total exploitation? Today's Explainer isn't just about ancient history, actually. It is a high-stakes moral conflict that really laid the groundwork for modern society as we know it. We are going to look at the catastrophic collision of worlds after 1492, the systems of control that were engineered to handle it, and the incredible moment the Spanish crown actually hit pause on its own empire to debate the humanity of the people it was conquering.
So here is our roadmap for today. Number 1, the labor crisis. Number 2, the Casta hierarchy. Number 3, the whistleblower. Number 4, the courtroom showdown. And finally, number 5, the legacy of contradiction.
Section 1, the labor crisis, the biological catastrophe of 1492.
So the crucial point is, when European colonizers arrived, they fully planned to build a massive tribute economy entirely on the backs of indigenous populations. But diseases and brutal conditions led to an absolute demographic collapse. Indigenous populations were perishing at rates that completely defied comprehension. And suddenly, the colonizers faced a massive labor crisis. So to extract wealth, the crown created the Encomienda system. By definition, the crown entrusted a specified number of indigenous people to a colonizer. In exchange for their labor and tribute, the colonizer, or the encomendero, was supposedly obligated to provide them with Christian instruction and military protection. In theory, this was framed as a reciprocal, paternalistic duty. But the reality on the ground? It was something entirely different.
Let's look at how this supposedly reciprocal arrangement actually played out step by step. Step 1, the crown grants the labor. Step 2, the colonizer makes their grand promises of protection and religion. But step 3 is where the illusion completely shatters. The encomienda was in practice a system of brutal, coerced labor. Encomenderos directed workers into agricultural estates and mines with absolute zero regard for their welfare. Just look at the silver mines of Potosí. They used a mercury amalgamation process there that exposed workers to toxic vapor, causing severe pulmonary damage. The life expectancy for indigenous miners at Potosí wasn't measured in years, it was literally measurable in months. It was a complete death sentence.
And to really grasp the scale of this devastation, just look at this data point from the island of Hispaniola. The estimated indigenous Taíno population at the time of European contact was roughly 3 million. But by the time this system had been in place for just a few decades, that number had been reduced to fewer than 200 survivors. 3 million, down to 200. The encomienda system was so lethal that it actually accelerated the very demographic collapse it depended on for its labor supply. It was a completely unsustainable contradiction.
Section 2. The Casta hierarchy. Race as colonial architecture.
And this brilliantly illustrates what happened next. With indigenous populations declining so rapidly, colonizers began importing enslaved Africans to replace the lost labor. This meant the demographic composition of the colonies was growing incredibly complex. To maintain order and control over this diverse population, the Spanish crown engineered a strict caste system. At the very top, you have the peninsulars. These are the Spanish-born elites holding all the highest offices. Right below them are the criollos, people of full Spanish descent but born in the Americas. They could be wealthy, but they were locked out of the highest royal offices. Then you have intermediate statuses like mestizos and mulattoes, which were based on mixed ancestries. And finally, at the absolute base of the hierarchy, bearing the heaviest labor obligations and having the fewest legal protections, were indigenous people and enslaved Africans. This system assigned legal status, tax obligations, and social standing strictly according to ancestry.
To enforce this, colonial artists produced elaborate casta paintings. These artworks depicted paired scenes of mixed-race families, explicitly labeling the racial status of their offspring. They were basically using art to visualize race as something visible, classifiable, and transmissible across generations. Now, it is important to note that actual colonial society on the ground was far more fluid and contested than these rigid paintings suggest. But as an ideological instrument for organizing inequality, it was incredibly powerful.
Section 3, the whistleblower. Enter Bartolomé de Las Casas.
Now, the abuses of the conquest and these systems of inequality did not go entirely unopposed within the Spanish world. Meet Fray Bartolomé de las Casas. He is the ultimate insider turned whistleblower. His life directly embodies the intense moral contradiction at the heart of Spanish colonialism. Let's track his incredible transformation on this timeline. In 1502, Las Casas actually arrived in the Caribbean as a colonizer. He participated in the economy. He was an encomendero himself. But around 1514, while preparing a sermon, he encountered biblical passages that triggered a profound moral crisis for him. He became convinced that the treatment of indigenous people was a mortal sin. By 1522, he abandoned his former life to become a Dominican friar. And in 1542, he wrote a polemical masterpiece called A Brief Account of the Devastation of the Indies. He basically became the most prominent 16th century advocate for indigenous rights.
In his brief account, Las Casas held absolutely nothing back. He provided harrowing eyewitness testimony. He wrote, "They seized food supplies and subjected indigenous men, women, and children to extreme violence with no regard for their vulnerability." He depicted mass atrocities carried out by armed men on horseback against completely defenseless communities. But he wasn't just writing this down for the history books. He cataloged these atrocities with stark detail to apply immense, direct political pressure on King Charles I to abolish the Encomienda system entirely.
Now, what's really interesting about this slide is looking at why his testimony was so impactful yet ultimately limited. First, he addressed it directly to his sovereign, invoking the king's Christian duty to protect innocent subjects. He demanded that military subjugation be replaced with peaceful missionary conversion. Because he was a reformed insider, a former encomendero, his testimony carried an undeniable authority. However, his advocacy did have a major limitation. Las Casas was still a European friar whose ultimate goal was Christianization. He questioned the brutal methods of colonization, absolutely, but he never fundamentally questioned Spain's right to colonize and convert the Americas in the first place.
Section 4. The Courtroom Showdown. The Valladolid Debate.
Las Casas' relentless lobbying eventually forced an absolutely extraordinary historical moment. In 1550, the Spanish crown literally suspended the conquest of the Americas. Let that sink in for a second. An empire paused its own expansion to convene a formal theological and philosophical debate in the city of Valladolid, just to determine if what they were doing was morally justifiable. 14 theologians and legal scholars sat on a panel to judge this unprecedented showdown, and the debate featured two main principles, perfectly opposed in their worldviews. On the left, we have Juan Ginés de Sepúlveda, a prominent humanist scholar. He argued using Aristotelian philosophy that indigenous people were natural slaves, essentially beings of inferior rationality whose subjugation by a superior culture was not only legitimate but actually beneficial. On the right, we have our whistleblower, Bartolomé de las Casas, arguing fiercely that all humans possess rational souls and natural equality, meaning they could only be converted through peaceful persuasion.
Let's look at Sepúlveda's argument first, which rested on four main claims to justify the violent status quo. First, he claimed that indigenous idolatry and ritual sacrifice legally justified military intervention. Second, he argued their supposed barbarism made them natural subjects requiring civilizing rule. Third, he positioned the Spanish as saviors, arguing that conquest protected innocent victims from harmful practices within indigenous societies themselves. And finally, he claimed that subjugation was simply the most effective way to spread Christianity, which he viewed as the ultimate good for any human soul.
Then Las Casas stepped up and countered Sepúlveda on absolutely every single point. He argued from natural law, stating that regardless of cultural practices, all humans have the capacity for reason. Because of this, peaceful persuasion is the only legitimate means of conversion. He dismantled the barbarism argument by pointing out that indigenous cultures actually exhibited highly sophisticated social and political organization. Lastly, utilizing his own eyewitness testimony, he argued that the actual conduct of the conquest was horrific, bearing zero resemblance to a benevolent civilizing mission.
Let's move to and see how this builds into Section 5, the legacy of contradiction, the birth of human rights.
So who actually won this epic debate? The truth is, neither man was officially declared the winner. The debate did not end the conquest, and the violent expansion in the Americas ultimately resumed. However, because of Las Casas' intense lobbying, the Crown had actually passed the new laws of 1542, which theoretically prohibited new encomiendas and sought to end indigenous enslavement. But colonial realities often found a way around morality. The encomienda simply evolved into a new system called the repartimiento.
Under this, colonial officials drafted rotating cohorts of indigenous workers for specific projects, especially mining. It distributed the labor burden a bit differently, but it completely preserved the coercive, forced nature of the work. Formal indigenous enslavement continued in disguised forms for generations. Basically, the loopholes swallowed the laws.
Think about what we've covered in this explainer. A colossal empire dependent simultaneously on the brutal labor and the spiritual salvation of the exact same people. The Viet-Aled debate didn't resolve this, but it was the very first time in any colonial empire that the rights of colonized people were seriously, formally debated at the highest levels of government. Las Casas' arguments for natural human equality survived. They were read, they were cited, and they were built upon by later generations. So I leave you with this to reflect on. How does this chaotic 16th century contradiction, passionately debating human rights while simultaneously maintaining oppressive systems through loopholes and hidden structures, echo into our world today? The conversation started in 1550, but it is for sure far from over. Thanks for joining me on The Explainer.